Welcome to the AI Silicon Valley podcast, where we cover all the topics related to artificial intelligence. We are here in the heart of Silicon Valley, here in Palo Alto, California. This is podcast number 14. My name is Eric Nilsson, and with me today I have my co-host Rajesh Krem. Rajesh, how you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Neha. How are you, Eric?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. It's been pretty cold here in the Bay Area.
Yes,
But
sure.
we're getting used to it, and it's been raining and storming, so we're filling up the reservoir. So I'm
Yeah,
happy
I
about
mean
that.
it's February,
Yeah.
so only a couple more months, I guess, a month and a half to go
Yeah,
before.
winter will be good.
Yeah,
On the show today, we are going to cover models everywhere. What does it mean? There's just been a lot of model news that's been going on, especially when you have the DeepSeek, which was its whole
yes,
framework
that
and
was the
model, and that kicked off the models that
yes,
everybody's talking about. So I thought we'd spend some time talking about the models and what is a model, and how are they used, and what's the difference between all these models, and try to make some sense of it, because I know a lot of people hear about these models, and some of you guys are actually using them and all
yes,
about them. Other
yes.
people know some, so maybe we'll talk beginning, get to know the models, and then we'll spend a little bit of time deep diving on some of the models and the architecture around those. So it should be fun. Should be
Yeah, sort of a little
fun
bit of back
conference.
to the basics kind
Yeah,
of,
yeah,
I think,
yeah,
episode today,
yeah. Bring
perhaps.
level set everybody, bring them up along the way, and then we can talk about it. But before we do that,
Yes.
why don't we talk a little bit about the news? What's been happening?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the news today seems like is Hugging Face, which is a model provider or model repository. They announced they're laying off about 10 salespeople. It's about 4% of their staff, so not a huge number, but it's salespeople, and that kind of got me thinking about what I've been seeing actually this past week or 10 days. There's so many providers who model serving providers who have just like everybody's getting in on that game, right? Because there's so many
Yeah.
applications that are getting built.
Yeah, I don't think it's actually consolidating yet, right? I think it's just these are
No.
just fine tuning. It seems like every week there's more, right?
Yeah.
Not less,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And at some point we'll probably have consolidation, right? That happens, but
It's still early. It's still early, probably,
right.
because
That's what I'd say.
yeah,
There's always going to be fluctuation when we were talking about these billions of dollars that everybody's putting into them, right?
right.
Like that might also scare off people and make them change how they're going to market, right? So you
Yes,
can
yes. I
expect
mean, I
that.
think once a major player gets funded in a particular space, I'm told generally venture dollars dry up for everybody else. So
Uh, and
it's
then
interesting.
in some additional news that I've been hearing about this week is Mark Zuckerberg, definitely came out a little bit more strong on the fact that DeepSeek is
Right.
not relevant. I think that's what he
Irrelevant,
said,
he
right?
said. Yeah,
Yeah,
irrelevant to
irrelevant,
their
right,
data center plans, I think, I
right,
believe. Yeah, yeah.
right.
Yeah, that's that was definitely my hunch last week, right?
Mm-hmm,
And I think
mm-hmm.
the news cycle around DeepSeek is still not dying down. It's insane. I mean, what started last Monday, 10 days down, it's still going, well, not strong, but yeah, I mean, my LinkedIn feed is
Right.
still full of that news. But yes,
Well, I know some of my AI stocks have rebounded nicely, and so
right.
clearly people are adjusting that and not panicking, right?
Yes,
And
yes. I mean, I think, yeah, like we discussed last week, yeah,
and
there's
that
a bunch of
and
reasons.
that gets into the conversation, which kicked off the conversation today, about what does models actually mean. And it seems like there's just more models out there every day. And I think OpenAI responded with more models to ChatGPT, right? So they
Right, right.
announced a couple different models. What did they announce?
Yeah, so they, given what happened with DeepSeek and all the publicity surrounding it, I think sort of OpenAI sort of fired back, I suppose,
Right.
and
And they were doing a little of that last week. We talked about the fact that they were going to respond, right? And
yes, they were going
I
to
think they
respond.
made the reasoning models free, right? So that was their first response was, oh, we're
That's
gonna
true.
we're gonna make whatever the model was free.
Oh,
So yeah,
yeah, I
right,
forget. I mean, these names are getting so confusing
right.
because, and then just to add to the confusion, I think this past Sunday they announced O3 Mini, and I think on Monday, maybe today's Wednesday, or yeah, so they announced the Operator, or no, sorry, Deep Research. They announced Deep Research, which is very similar to DeepSeek, and I believe Google also has a product that they launched last year called Deep Research. So there's a bunch of names going around here with with the word deep in them, among other things. So I think definitely OpenAI is striking back, right? And they clearly have a upper hand here with all those captive users. 300 million weekly active users. I believe they have about 25 million paid users now. So that's a pretty significant chunk of so they have market traction, so they're in a position to move from a position of strength, I guess.
I ran into a Alaskan Husky in Palo Alto. We're in the heart of Silicon Valley, and this Husky was on the floor at Kirk Steakburgers, which is a famous place in Palo Alto. People know of it, right? You get steak burgers, charcoal grilled steak burgers, and there was this Husky that was just laying there, and there was a woman that had it on a leash, and she had went up to get a new soda or something and came back, and I was talking to her about her Husky, and she knows Elon Musk, right? And she knows a bunch of AI people in the Bay Area, and she was talking about it. We started talking about Optimus Prime and Optimus, the robot, and AI capable, and I got recruited, right? Like she knows them, and she's like, "Hey, give me your phone number. We'll recruit you. You can come help." She asked me, "What do I want to do with the last 10 years of my career?" Right.
Wow.
And I said, well, I don't think I would leave Broadcom because I currently work day job at Broadcom. And they do AI chips and they do good stuff, and I like it. And I like hardware. And so we got into AI and gene editing, CRISPR, a little bit of, brain research on that. And she goes, what would you like to do? If you had anything to do, Eric, what would you do? And I said, I'd probably go work on Optimus with Tesla, right? Because I think that marrying AI into a robot would be cool. So that was a little bit of fun this week that happened, right?
That is an interesting
a shout out to Buddy, the help rescue dog, because he does rescue dogs, and it was a fascinating conversation that I could name names of people that she knew, but she told me not to do that. Right? So I can use the Buddy rescue dog name. That's about it.
Buddy. Okay.
But we got talking about like AI and the fact that marrying it with a robot is going to be kind of cool. So
it is. It's going to be interesting times. I know you're super interested in
and that comes back to models and the fact that Tesla has a model for their car. They have models for their robots. Like there's a lot of models out there, and agentic workflows plug into these models. But we'll get a little more into that as we move forward. Last thing that I thought from a news perspective that I thought was interesting was the fact that OpenAI started talking a little more strongly about DeepSeek as well, where I think they actually used, and I might be wrong on this, but I think they were using stolen now.
Is the word?
Is the word is that it wasn't just they used their API out of terms. They were now being a little stronger in their vocabulary of, hey, they stole our stuff, right? That they did not have rights to that. They weren't supposed to access it, and so the idea that DeepSeek went off and magically made some model that had lower weights, right? And that's how they got it done so fast. Where in fact it comes out that maybe they had GPU resources since 2018. OpenAI says, they stole our stuff, right? Like it's easy to harvest AI, when you can just go get the weights for your models by just copying them.
I think distillation definitely. I mean, I didn't read that particular news item, but I believe you. I mean, very well, Sam Altman may have used that word. In fact, I think one update from last week actually around DeepSeek is that the question of how much money did they use, how much access did they have to compute resources, etc. The number last week is around 500 million was the number that was floated. I mean, that 6 million, half a billion actually was the number in terms of number of GPUs they had, etc. But this week, the updated number from like SemiAnalysis, one of the sort of reliable sources around this, is that they may have about 1.5 billion worth of sort of GPU compute cluster resources. So that's a much bigger number than was previously believed. So that's an interesting one as well. It's a developing story.
Interesting. We talked a little bit about Buddy's owner. We talked a little bit about Eric Schmidt from Google, right, and what he's up to, right?
Right.
Actually, she knows him, and she knows a bunch of the other, like Elon. It's like, hey, this rescue dog owner, right?
Right.
You know, is and she actually flipped out, like, oh yeah, in fact, I got Eric's latest book, and she handed it to me here,
Oh,
and
okay.
she's like,
The
here,
$1 trillion coach.
yeah,
Yeah,
the
of
$1 trillion
course.
coach,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
She's,
yeah.
okay, and
Yes.
it's like yeah, it's just a
It's
interesting.
that's a good
conversation.
book actually. Definitely, I've read that book actually.
Wow,
I've read the
very
book.
good, very
I've
good.
read the book.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think
Yeah.
Bill Campbell is legendary figure. It turns out in the
Yeah,
Valley.
yeah. And so in Silicon Valley, you just bump into people at like the hamburger shop, right? You know,
Right.
and this person actually kind of looked a little bit homeless, right? Like when I thought I was being nice, going like, oh, hey, you got a nice dog. She goes, yeah, it's a help dog, right? You know, it goes around and she takes it around Stanford and
Right.
lets kids hug, and they were going to head down to LA, and
Interesting.
they're going
Yeah.
to help the fire victims, and so she's a whole narrative. But then she starts taking technology, and she starts talking about AI, and she starts talking about, like, only in Silicon Valley can you just
never
bump
know.
into
You never know.
into
Yeah.
people like that, right?
Absolutely.
Fun.
You absolutely don't know. But yeah,
All right,
no,
I
that's
think
fantastic.
that's
Yeah.
it for the news as far as I'm concerned, like what's actually happening this week.
Yeah,
It
let's
seems
dive
like,
right in. I mean, let's talk about what we have in our mind.
models.
Yeah. So
models.
I think but the sort of preamble on this, right? Models everywhere, is with in addition, Hugging Face, right, is one of the first sort of model repository locations, right, where people used to put open source models, and they eventually started, providing APIs once you upload a model, and so on, so that you can do inferencing and playground and so on. Now, what I've noticed literally in the last like week, 10 days is like multiple players are beginning to now kind of enter the fray where APIs are available, basically, right? So, and I can think of at least three players: Fireworks AI, Writer, as in writing, right? Writer.com, 1, 2, Together AI, maybe 3. And of course, not to speak of the hyperscalers, obviously, right? Like you have Amazon Bedrock as an example, right, where you can go run any model that you want, and so as Azure, OpenAI as well. Amazon, I think Azure has a AI Foundry that they just launched a couple of months ago. So it's even outside of the hyperscalers, there's all this competition now, right? Like and some of these services provide add-on vector databases, knowledge graphs, etc., that allow you to get up and running faster. That's kind of the key point here. So anyway, I mean, so models are certainly everywhere, right? And with DeepSeek, seems like the narrative around like, hey, models are not only hyper competitive to operate in, but they're also sort of not the place where margins, like where the money is going to be. The money is going to be in application layer, just like it happened with SaaS. So
let's talk about the layers for a little bit, because I think that for some people that are listening to this, they might not understand, exactly how the layers come together. So I thought I would just try to paint a picture if you're listening to this, right?
Yes.
You have your hardware, right? Which motherboard, CPU, all that, right? And then you have a GPU, right? And then you can have lots of GPUs, right? And so that's the hardware layer, right? And on top of that is an operating system, right? That you put, right, when you're building an AI platform, right? I'll call it the AI platform, right? Which is hardware, operating system. And if I look at NVIDIA, if you look at the NVIDIA Jetson box or the new box they announced, I forget the name of that one that we talked about.
NVIDIA.
That comes with an operating system as well. It's a pared down Linux, right? They took a pared down Linux, and then that just gives you enough framework there to then run some code base, right? And then you then will have a code base that will allow you to generate an AI model, right? And that code base can sometimes they call that whole code base a model, right? And so there's kind of a dual use term here. It seems like, from my perspective, there's the code base that's generating the model, and you're using to interact with the model and get data back from the model, and that's a whole framework. And if you look at an architecture diagram, it has a whole bunch of pieces, right? Learning pieces and cycling pieces, and like if you Google it, there's like 30 pieces to this whole model generator, right? And then there's the data itself, which people also will call a model, right? And I think you need both of them to actually use a model. So maybe that's all just one term, right? And we call it the model, but the model in the database with the weights, right? Which I would consider the model, but it's actually the model is everything, and then it's the API that you would use that model for, right?
Yeah, but Eric, also, do you think, like, so there's the, let's say, PostgreSQL sort of, right, database. Then you have a vector database, say Pinecone or something, ChromaDB, right? Now those things sit outside of the model, right? I don't know exactly where the model weights.
So it reminds me of like Apache, where Apache is a web server that has all the things you need in it, right? And then it uses any database. You can connect it to SQL Server, you can connect to MySQL, you can connect it to Oracle's database. Like, so the database is just an interface, and they probably have each model must have a database they're capable of working with, and maybe a couple that they're capable of working with, or if it's just SQL, or it's another, if it's another more complicated database, then
or a knowledge graph, knowledge graph RAG, any sort of
MongoDB or others that are more object-oriented relational databases.
Neo4j,
So the database can separate from the model. But the data that's in the database is also considered a model, right? Because you need the weights. The weights sit in the database, and so we use the term model, I think, interchangeably from the whole framework to the data that sits in the database. But maybe those are just called the weights, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, learning is weights to the nodes, right, and node points, and then the model itself is the application that allows you to assign those weights along with the weights themselves, right? And so we bundle that up, and then we name that a model, like Llama, right? Is a whole framework. But then if you want to train Llama with data, you would consider that a model targeted at a given solution set. And so sometimes they call that the model, right? But the model has to come with the framework, the Llama, with your trained weights, right? So that's
it's right? I mean, maybe then one way of thinking about this is a model could be something that predicts tokens, the next token prediction. So whatever
weight,
the set of the code base necessary for generating your next set of tokens, right? As you predict a particular sentence, right? Like a generative capacity, right? Like maybe that container would be a model, right? And it needs other things to run with it.
And so we wouldn't call the data that's stored the model. We would just call the whole the application itself the model.
Application itself the model, and then the model, of course, has been trained on data.
There's data in the database that represents the model, right? Or represents what it can do.
What it can do. There's been a learning capacity that's embedded in the model. Right.
That then gets.
So the neural network has
then
been.
The neural network gets trained.
Yes.
Right. And that's what's sometimes people that data that got trained, they call that the model, right? Or but I guess that's not the model. That's the weights that the model uses. So when we talk about ChatGPT announcing a new model, right, which they did, and you name them early on, the
O3 Mini High and O3 Mini that they just I think released this past week.
And one of them is good at coding.
Yes.
Right. And so they announced this model, and the model is not only the weights in the database, but also the framework that they've used to generate those weights in the database, and that's all considered a model.
Right.
So,
it's interesting you use the word database. I never thought of a model as embedding a database in it, but maybe it does. I'm not.
It doesn't. The model has to store its data.
Right.
So the trained numerics, the GPU is generating, floating points, 64-bit floating point, weights that have to be stored somewhere.
Right.
Guess where they store them?
Right.
In the database.
Yeah.
So those weights could be considered a trained model, right? Like the weights, but you need the model framework or the model itself to interpret those weights and do something with it.
Yeah.
And so all that is considered a model. Right. Then they have open source models, and then they have proprietary models.
Right.
ChatGPT is a proprietary model.
That's right.
And so you don't get to mess with the code that generates the weights, right? You might be able to use it to train, but really OpenAI is already running that model, and it's doing the weight training in real time.
Mhm.
And then me as a customer just come in and use that, right?
Yes.
So I'm not really training, or I'm not using ChatGPT to make a new learning. I'm just
Yeah.
using what they've given you, right?
And I think
Right.
one important distinction here is that my understanding is that the weights are not like modified in real time, right?
Right.
But
they
but
right,
pre-configured, right?
right, right.
But then there's
On
reasoning.
a farm of massive GPUs.
Right.
Right.
But so I think there's a distinction between reasoning models and these pre-trained models, right?
That's right. And that's
So-
the difference between reasoning model and pre-trained, right?
That's right. So the reasoning models
is actually probably working in real time.
in real time, it's reasoning, right? So some of the sort of compute capacity
it's
from
assigning
training
weights in real time based on what it's thinking,
or reassigning weights,
Right,
if you will,
reassigning weights.
right? Yeah,
Right.
it's reassigning weights in
Right.
real time, I believe, right? Like, so that whole reinforcement learning sort of mechanism
Right.
is sort of modified, right? In
Right.
in a reasoning sort of situation.
Right.
So
So to not go too far away from the thread here, we say we have the closed models, which are ChatGPT and Anthropic, I think are the two that come to mind, right? Where they
Yes.
give you whole program models that you can use
an API,
use
essentially.
API to get results back from.
Yeah,
right. And
that's
then
right.
They host those on their own servers, and then you pay a micropayment for every time you engage with their APIs.
That's right.
And
That's right.
Yeah, and then they're constantly making new models based on they released a model that does better programming, so they release that and they set a price target on it, and then when you use that model, you're getting results back and you're getting micropayment charges to your account.
And then that's on the basis, just to be sort of, it's based on the basis of number of tokens used.
Right.
Right.
So then, all right, so that's the closed source. Then we have the open source models, which they give you the whole framework, all the code for the whole thing, along with the weights, right? They might have already trained it, and then they're giving you the code base and they're giving you the weights in the database, and that's like Llama, right? Like they have that. But because it's open source, you can get at the whole thing and train it yourself. You could wipe out the database and use it to make your own AI,
model, right?
Your own AI that does that. And
that's right.
And we do that at VMware, right? VMware has a proprietary that we fed it our own, hypervisor source code, and it learns everything. And then it's our private model. A lot of the open source are used to generate private models for whatever you need it to do.
That's right.
That's right. And so then you can have open source versions that get released, and there are multiple open source vendors, right, that are market leaders in model generation, right? And a model, and some of them already pre-program their model and give you a pre-programmed model, and you can get it and run it, and you don't have to train it at all, right? So that's the model hierarchy, right? I think that is good to understand, right? Because then on top of the models, you have hosting providers that are providing those models.
So Eric, maybe before we go there, right? I want to maybe tease apart the difference between, let's say, you guys using all the hypervisor source code, for example, and
training it. Yep.
Is that tuning? Is that fine tuning, right? Like, so there's pre-training, training, fine tuning, right? Like an inference.
Yeah, well, I think in our case, because we didn't want to have any code that was that would not be our code.
That's right.
Right. So it's generating code that we're putting in our products. We have to be assured that we don't have any other learnings in there that would not be our own, because we could get sued for, ownership rights. So I think we did start with our own clean, data set, and then trained it.
Yeah. So that's the fine tuning, right? So if I take a data set and fine tune, I'm not really changing the model weights, or I'm not modifying the model per se in any way, right?
Well, you're not you're not modifying the model from the standpoint of the code that generates the model.
Yes.
You are running it and teaching the database, weights on all the terms it found in the source code. And in fact, the terms themselves, are it's learning. And maybe it learns, maybe that model already knows about C and C++, that vocabulary. And so we don't have to retrain that. And so to your point, it already has weights on how to write code. And that all we're doing is what did you call it? Retraining or
fine tuning.
Fine tuning. Yeah,
Fine-tuning,
maybe
right?
we're just fine tuning the models that are already in present for code generation.
That's right. And I want to contrast this with, let's say, I'm an AI engineer, a developer, and I go take Llama, let's say 7 billion or 70 billion parameter model, and I play with it, right? And then I create a new model that is meant to do certain things, right? It's probably good at coding or something else, and I upload it on, say, Hugging Face, right? Now that's a new model that somebody could take and then go run with it and then fine tune it on some other data set, right? Like, so that I think is kind of, I just want to kind of draw out the difference between these two things, I think, right? Where the engineer is actually changing some more fundamental aspects of the model versus just training or tuning it with new data.
Right. That makes sense. Sense.
Yeah.
So then we climb up the stack, right? Which is all these other companies, right, that are doing various things, like Hugging Face, right? Like, so Hugging Face says, hey, you've got all these open source models that you need a place to store them. So GitHub does that, right, for source code, right? Like they tailor their service to allow you to upload, a Llama model that you've modified or generated, right, or enhanced, right, and then upload that. So that you have a repository. So I think that's how they started out. And there are other companies that have kind of compete in that space as well, right? Where you can make, I think if you ever used MakerBot, where you've done 3D printing, they got sites that you can go download the models of all kind of plastic parts, right? All kind of things, right? And sites specialize in storing of those models so that I, as a general user, can go get one, download it, and 3D print it, right? And so in the model land, that's what I call a model, a 3D model.
That's a different kind of model.
Right, 3D printed.
Yes,
something,
CAD printed model.
Yeah, right, exactly. But nonetheless, the concept is I need a place to store that model as a repository so other people can, gain access to it. And in this case, also there are service providers, cloud providers that are not just storing the model, but actually 3D printing the model or running the model on their computer. Running their model in, and then they give you APIs to get at it, and away you go, and you don't have to worry about GPUs or compute resources. They're basically cloud providers.
Yeah, that's abstracted away, so to speak, right? Like, so you don't have to worry about it. Yeah, and I think again, clearly there's a proliferation happening around that. So I think you are now, I think we are sort of in the stack. Now we are transitioning to the application layer, right? So there's the models, and then there's applications that sit on top of these models. Right. And maybe
and ChatGPT is one of the applications that sits on top of all this, and I just see it as a little text string, and I go in and ask it questions, and it gives me answers. PipeIQ.
Yeah, PipeIQ is also an application that is so OpenAI has ChatGPT, which is an application that runs models underneath, right? Photo, O3 Mini, and so on and so forth, right? And PipeIQ could, part of the stack uses OpenAI, and so we would also sit on some of their APIs, right, and use it for different things, right, including Azure OpenAI, for example. So now in that application layer, there is a lot of latitude as to what you do, which models you use. And maybe one thing we could talk about here, Eric, maybe is like small language models and large language models, right? Meaning, right, so you have the general purpose models, let's say GPT-4o or, 4. Overall, I can go to ChatGPT and ask any question. It could be quantum physics. It could be, how to, where can I find the best diapers? I don't know, right? Right. And it's going to be pretty good at both, right? Versus if Tesla, as we were discussing, I mean, if you were doing a driverless car, or you need models that are hyper trained just on driving data, right, and behavior and so on and so forth. So, and not to say that a Tesla model is a small language model, certainly not. But maybe if you're talking about selling, right, like a B2B buying process or selling process. Now that could be a SLM, right, small language model that's trained on specific data, and doesn't need to be like a 700 billion parameter model or whatever, right? Like could be a much smaller model. Inference costs are cheaper. and I mean, we don't need to talk about the edge and so on, right? But yeah,
Right.
basically it's cheaper inference, right? Like,
Right,
and maybe
yeah.
easier to find.
And when you say inference, you mean training, right?
Excuse
Where
me.
you're meaning just being able to train that model,
No,
or
no,
is it
inference,
using?
I'm talking about
Okay.
inferencing, using, right?
Okay.
Like every time I have a question, the user
Right.
query, I pass it to
Right.
the model and
Right.
get a
Find
response.
model. Right.
So I think there is a difference around that
And then,
as well.
and then you get like robots that you just need to look at camera data and then know which way to turn, right, left, like a small mini robot. My
Yes.
lawnmower in the backyard that's now an automatic mower that just figures out my backyard and runs around and looks for things. That has to have an AI model in it that's learning my backyard, and then and it's probably a micro model or something that's made for in the embedded market, right? So then you got models that are fitting the size, right, to your point, right, of the application itself.
Right? That's right. So I think that's an interesting one. And then so that would be one thing. So, and applications are not going to use just one model, multiple models, right, for different things, right? And you might end up fine tuning things for like one model that just writes emails, another model that, I don't know, replies to emails, who knows, right? Like, so another model that is able to do lead research,
right?
And so on and so
this
forth.
this is getting into Kubernetes microservices, right, where the architecture for an application at the high end might take advantage of many different models, right? Like Kubernetes microservices does that, where they break down the application into a bunch of tiny little things that are delivered from different web places, right? Web properties. And so I guess you could have multiple models hosted at multiple places to build your application.
You could be. I mean, that probably would make it more cumbersome. In fact, I have some first-hand experience with that. It probably.
I'm not saying recommended to do that. I'm just saying
you could absolutely.
Of, our original topic, models everywhere.
Yes,
that's just going to be a natural occurrence.
I agree.
Time, right?
I agree. Absolutely. Because even I'm noticing that all these different providers have different sort of capabilities, right? And even if you want to play around with it and see what works better for you, right? That could just be within your application. In the back end, you are accessing multiple places, and it's all abstracted away. For the user on the front end, it makes no difference, right? Except in quality.
And you just have a little bit of an aha moment here as well, in that Amazon is talking about double downing and investing in third-party models, right? And third-party, and as a hosting service, they're big on having developer frameworks, right? If you look at Amazon's secret sauce, it's really about all of the development code they have. So if you want to do pizza ordering right now, they have a module. Somebody uploaded an AWS in the development portal, the ability, an API to figure out where you are, your GPS phone data, and if you order a pizza, it'll automatically figure that out and do it if you're on your phone, right? And so they give you all that framework so I can see the mad rush to now have a bunch of AI models available to their programming, their consumers that are building applications, because AI will be a critical part of what type of application you build in the future.
Correct.
And you better have a whole bunch of models that can get you the various components.
Yes.
And then I guess I should ask a question also, like agentic workflows, right?
Yes.
Like how does that plug into the models themselves? Is it part of the model? Is it a separate piece of the model? Or is it like a microservice where you just have these other pieces that you use? I think they're both, they're other pieces, right?
I think there are other pieces. These are agents, I think, are, again, code frameworks, a piece of code that calls a model to do a certain action, right? And then is able to pass off information, if necessary, to another agent, which can then pick it off and do something else, right? So I think it's agentic workflows is more of a framework, the way I think about it, right? Which is all powered by Gen AI, of course, right? Like the model is the one that has to sort of make some of those decisions, etc. And a lot of this is driven by prompting, actually, right? That's how you're communicating with the LLM or SLM. So I think agentic workflows, just to sort of make this clear for our listeners, is something that sits on top of, top of the models, but underneath the application layer, if you will, right? Because these applications are going to, I mean, as we move forward in 2025 and beyond, are going to embed these agentic workflows, right? So
it's less about the model. It's even less about AI, and it's more about just enabling AI workflows, right?
It's enabling workflows, but
Right.
that's AI is central to each node in that in a given workflow, like the multiple
Right.
nodes.
No, I'm just saying
Yeah.
you need the AI, but the agentic part is maybe the connection to what actually has to happen.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
Like,
And you know what is interesting, Eric, here actually, in terms of what has to happen, right? It seems like the AI, given the right kind of instructions and goals, is
Mhm.
also able to decide on its own what it needs to do. Now that is kind of
Right,
mind.
yeah, I think there's going to
Yeah,
be a tug of
mind
war
boggling.
on this,
Yeah.
but then there's also the piece I think you were talking about. Somebody's coming out with the browser that will automatically click for you
Yeah, yeah,
and do
yeah.
the
That's
travel,
the
right? Like,
that's the operator.
right,
OpenAI just released last week what
yeah,
it calls the operator, and
right,
that is the virtual, you know.
right. And to me, that has an agentic
Oh
component
yeah,
to it, right? Because it's figuring out how the AI is the engine, the model that's coming up with what needs to be done. But then something has to drive around and do those things, right? Like if it's a car, it has to steer the steering wheel.
yeah.
If it's a travel website, it has to actually go and book
That's right.
the flight.
Yeah.
Right.
No, but I think the decision making, I think, is something interesting that needs to be brought out. So today, I vaguely just remember now. I saw this thing about where somebody had built an agent or agentic workflow where they were trying to get Twitter followers, right? And that agent decided to tip people if they followed the account, right? Now, that's an example of where the AI deciding on its own what to do to get more followers. The goal is clear, to get more followers. So that, I think, is the sort of autonomous capability, right? So that's kind of, I see that as the promise for agentic workflows, because there's multiple combinations, right, you can do, right? And the AI is able to decide what to do, right? That is the promise here. So even when booking a flight, it can decide, right, what's the right configuration to go. If I say, hey, book a flight under $2,000 for an international flight to, I don't know, to India, it can go make its decisions on the, within the constraints, right?
Right.
That is an interesting sort of view. So yeah, any case, I mean, all of this is going to sit in the application layer,
Right.
And I think inferencing needs will continue to balloon, I think.
Right. So much like the industry has players, right? Like I think I saw a map of all the models that are out there, along with the companies that are trying to deliver those models, and then map them onto cloud services, right? And all of a sudden, you do get hundreds of the ecosystem of hundreds of players and
Right.
hundreds of models and hundreds of deliverables, right?
Right.
That are out there, and
Yeah.
and then the cloud providers are wrestling with who's going to own them, and where they're going to be on their stack, and it just makes me wonder, when is it going to consolidate, or is it going to consolidate, or is it going to grow to like
Yeah.
1,000 models and 1,000 players with services like the GitHubs of the world? Are they going to get into the space too? Because
Right.
everybody wants to be a part of it, and
Yeah.
it should be interesting to see, and it is models everywhere, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think we
And
are
it's an ecosystem of these models, right? It's an ecosystem of delivery of these models, right?
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Like, so if you're an AI developer today, right, even compared to 6 months ago, I would
Right.
say, or even 8 months ago, this whole middleware layer of where enabling you to sort of quickly run and deploy run models and test them and see what
Right.
works for you is in a what should we say, low code kind of capability. Low code, no code capability is only coming up now, right? This was not there 8 months ago, 12 months ago, right?
Right.
So and I say this because I'm trying to illustrate the fact that there is every few months there's a new class of developers who are getting added to this AI engineer category. You
Right.
see,
Right.
because because it's all kind of, you have to pull multiple things together to kind of get the output, the right kind of output that you want, right? And that's kind of hard. So this is one point.
It's interesting, and this is an aside, but it just popped into my head where we hear the Silicon Valley, the big tech guys, the top 7 or whatever, say they paused on hiring programmers because of AI, right?
Mhm.
Like, and you hear this like, oh, we're refactoring and we're figuring, and I'm realizing that this is such a big framework change
Mhm.
that any application that you're starting to look at probably has to have an AI component. And when you have to have an
Yes.
AI component, you're going to have to tell all your web engineers and your designers and everybody that they have to worry about this now. And that's just a retraining. Right?
Absolutely.
Everybody's going to have to take a pause and figure out how are they going to refactor everything. And it's not that AI is actually writing all the code. It's just that they're taking a pause while they retrain everybody on what the next application is going to look like. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
And it's not even about, I don't know about pause, but like a lot of people seem to have a hard time wrapping their heads around what that retraining looks like just for themselves.
Yeah,
Forget
right,
for others or
right,
organizationally, but even for themselves, I think there is a little bit of a mental leap, right? Crossing the chasm kind of thought process that is needed here, right? Which I find, I mean, some people seem to have a harder time with that. So yes, the Silicon Valley, yes. I mean,
Yeah, it's slowing down, or just
yeah.
it's in a pause mode while they're trying to refactor what does it mean.
Right? Yes.
Right.
What is it? Yeah, I agree.
And I've heard that Apple, with Apple Intelligent, they took the whole car business unit and canned it and took all the programmers and said, guess what, you're all going to be working on AI now, right?
Right.
Yeah, and so.
Right.
So, and a lot of companies are now trying to do that, or trying to figure out how do they put all this together. Right?
Yes, and it's that's the point here. Right? I mean, there is a fair degree of complexity to this, right? And the tech is whatever 2.5 years old, so 2.5.
It makes my head hurt. When you really think about a lot of coders, a lot of people trying to come home going, okay, I'm getting a new job now, right? Like I'm gonna be writing AI code.
Right. And then two things here that come to mind, Eric. One is Mark Andreessen. A shout out to I think his latest podcast with Lex Friedman. Quite an amazing podcast. But he says, the world is going to need more developers than ever. He doesn't think the number of developers is actually going to increase.
Right. That's what I would say. I think it is. That's what I was kind of alluding to. Is like, even though there's a pause, I don't see us needing less developers. I think that probably everybody's just trying to figure out what they need before they start hiring again. Right?
Yeah.
And retraining the people that they do have to kind of get used to this and spinning up the projects. Right.
And you're talking about the Magnificent Seven or whatever, right? Like the big seven here in the Valley. But imagine what is going to happen when there's citizen developers or whatever, like a new class of people can be onboarded as developers. You see, that is the big promise here. So an example in point is, actually, we didn't talk about this in the news, but there's a company called Replit, A16Z funded company. And what they have is like, they have an IDE, right, in the backend in their platform that allows you to basically create an application very fast, right? Like, because you don't need to worry about the EC2, how to configure it, blah, 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 database. Everything is sort of built out for you. Now, this is a bit of a PR stunt, but they have released something today or yesterday where you can build an application in minutes on your phone, right? Now, just with the prompt, with natural language prompts.
Right.
Now, imagine, right, what it's going to unlock, right? Like, you've never coded in your life, but here's this thing, right? And you can spin it. So there's going to be 1,000 flowers blooming in that way, right? From people who have never coded. So I think there is a little bit of that promise here that is going to be super impressive. Also on the application layer, essentially, right? I mean, the analogy here could be.
That's the beautiful thing about humans, that we can dream up more stuff than we can do. Right? So
more stuff that we can do.
The reality is, yes, you're going to need more programmers because it's going to make it easier to do it. Right. You're going to spend less time writing if then else, and while loops and all that. And you're just going to spend more time speccing out what you want and letting the AI do it. Right. I think that is the case. And I always said that when I was working at Sun Microsystems and the operating system and that, and I looked at how many kernel engineers we actually had, like we only had 20 real kernel engineers, right?
That's it.
We had 500 or 600 people in the org, right? That's how many other people you needed to test and to design and to spec and to write and to manage. And like, if you really distill down how many coders you actually had working on the operating system, it was like 20, right? All the rest of the people were just minutia, right?
Right.
Like, and some of those 20 had helpers and stuff that would kind of help them. There
Right.
were other programmers, right?
Right.
But if you really looked at who was doing it, it was like 20, right? And you're like,
Mm.
the file system's written by one guy, right? Like
Wow.
this guy, and he had one helper, right?
Wow.
And he wrote the whole file system. And they made a new file system one year. It was like a new dynamic file system, and
Mhm.
Unix had an old file system that had been around forever. And finally, everybody they wrote a new file system, that, and it was one guy, right?
Wow.
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
AI is not going to replace all those
Yeah.
other people, right?
No,
that are
no.
helping. It might help the one guy code faster, or maybe the AI will do the coding, but all the other people that support the product still need to be there.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one thing I'm definitely what I've noticed is that AI is going to write code for you, right? And it
Right.
already is, right?
Right,
With
yeah, sure.
Cursor and
Mhm.
Windsurf and
Yeah.
all that. What I think is the critical attribute, if you're a good coder, if you're a good engineer, I think you're able to interpret what the code is doing, right? Like, because you need to evaluate what this thing is telling you. Is it correct? Is it hallucinating? Is it just like cooking up a new function call? I think so. Good developers slash engineers, I think, have an edge in this era, like because they don't have to write the code, but they have to evaluate the code and make sure it's correct, right?
Right.
So I think there is that as well. So I think people will be able to write a lot of code now, clearly. But
right.
yeah,
Well,
if you can't.
Yeah, I think it's been
Evaluate
an interesting conversation. I'm glad that we were able to kind of like peel back the onion layers a
Yeah.
little bit around what are all the models and what why are they blooming, and why every week we talk about more models and the price changes that are the reasoning models, the open
Yes.
source models, and then the Hugging Face and other repository and SaaS providers, and then the applications that live on top of all this, right? And
Right.
it's like getting that in your head so that you kind of can be AI savvy around that. And then various listeners of this podcast obviously are at different levels, right?
Right.
Yeah, there are
Right.
people that are delivering compute resources for AIs, right? There's
Right.
cloud providers, and then there's applications up at the Pipe IQ level, right?
Right.
And then there's consumers of the AIs, and some of you guys are just consuming AIs and listen to this show because you want to learn about what's new at the consumer level, right?
Right.
And so we drift up and down that whole stack, but we never really spent some time talking about the models themselves.
Right.
Are there any other key points that we need to make when it comes to models?
I don't know. I think
Because we're running up on the hour. We have
yeah,
only
I think
only a
we
few more
can.
minutes
Yeah.
left here.
I mean, we can end early. I'm totally okay. Let's see. I think one other thing is just models.
No, I don't want to end early, by the way. I was just saying we got to get everything in before we run out of time.
Before we run out of
Right,
time.
don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, I think maybe there's models on the edge. I think that's also an emerging trend, I think. So I was speaking to an entrepreneur just yesterday or day before where it's a meeting application, and the model, they are running a model locally on the desktop of the of the Mac. Actually, it's a Mac app.
Right.
So the model is running on your desktop, and it's not leaving. The data is not leaving the desktop, like your laptop. So
Right.
and all the training of the model is just happening locally. So that I think is an interesting thing, right? Where I mean, there are different reasons why you would do this, but one of the security, privacy, right? Like privacy. I mean, around this data ownership, but also like inference costs, like you're using the local compute resources versus doing stuff on Amazon, right? Things like that. But that is models on the edge. I mean, these are small language models, obviously.
Yes, of course.
Right. Yeah. Is a interesting dynamic, right? Compared to stuff like PipeIQ, which runs all on the cloud, right? And we don't rely really.
The strange thing that I think about when I think about models on the edge is that how do you know where they're going to go? Because they're learning and they're learning new things, and I guess you have to have a framework or guardrails around what that model. Like I have a little model up on my telephone pole that's managing my local cell network, right? And it's learning while it's doing this, and like how do you know what your models have learned? Now, to some degree, virtualization pushes this content on the edge, and then they back it up and they keep track, and there is a way to manage the models out on the edge, right? But it is interestingly tricky. Like if my lawnmower has a model that it's generating my backyard, like How is that model getting backed up? Or I guess
Yeah.
if my lawnmower breaks, I just have to get a new one and it learns all over again. Right? Like,
I mean, not just, I mean, one is the backup question, but actually the more interesting question here is learning, actually, right? Like, so your lawnmower is learning a bunch of stuff, right? And if I'm running the meeting app on my machine, it's learning a ton about me, right?
Right.
So actually, the word that came to mind yesterday when I was discussing with him was reverse distillation, actually. So meaning, right, like think about DeepSeek. DeepSeek pinged a larger language model, OpenAI,
Right.
and learned a ton and devised a new model, right? Now, think about this framework of, let's say I have 100 computers and all of them are running this meeting app, and I have a model on the on my server that's hosted. What if I were to take the learnings from these small language models and feed it back to the large language model in a privacy preserving way, hopefully, right? And that's kind of going to be sort of the reverse distillation process. So that's this, right? So then this large language model is learning a bunch of stuff in a privacy compliant way, and now can deliver better services, right? Like, so the new model it deploys for the next person is going to be smarter. So that's, I thought, was a pretty interesting concept.
Yeah, I could see that computer science people are just going to be managing our models, right? Like it's just going to be like, how do you manage the models and the data for the models and integrations of models and multiple models giving you pieces. It's like it reminds me of the Sun Microsystems day back in the 90s or late 80s, where they had network objects everywhere. NOE or DOE, distributed objects everywhere. That was I think it was called DOE, not Neo, DOE, and distributed object everywhere. Eric Schmitz worked on that when he was at Sun, and he worked on my building. I knew him. They had that project, and I look at the same thing here, but this is actually it's neural network models everywhere, right? And they all tie together to build, larger applications, right?
That's
and
right.
Then, and they're all propagating that learning back up to the,
to
the whole model, right?
Right.
Like, I don't know,
right.
It hurts my head when we think too much about this, right? And all I want is my car to drive me around, my Tesla to drive me around, and be happy. And my phone gets smarter every
other day. Yeah,
every other day. So
I heard Elon Musk is going to launch. I think maybe he announced it on his earnings call, but they're going to launch a car without a steering wheel by the end of 25. I think is it right?
Yeah, well, he's always about 4 years off his prediction, but that was the idea. The idea was that's why he was investing. That's why he believes that the future of the car company is self-driving everything, and it's gonna, you're gonna just have these fleets of cars that are available from your iPhone, and you're just gonna say, Siri, bring me a car, or get me to A, B, C, and it's just gonna do it. Car's gonna show up at your driveway. You're just not gonna keep a car anymore, right? Because it's gonna be way cheaper just to ask for a ride somewhere than it is to actually, and it's gonna be we already do that in our expense reports, right? Like we already turn in mileage, and it's like 20 cents a mile, or maybe it's at 28 cents a mile now because of increased energy costs. But like at some point when you say, well, if you're willing, right now that doesn't work out, they don't come pick me up for 28 cents a mile, because if I want to go up to my grocery store right now and get an Uber ride, it's going to be $8, right? Where it's only 2 miles away, so that should be like 49 cents or 62 cents or something, right? To make that ride. But because the driver's involved, but if you have an AI that's driving the car and it's it's just monitored, and somebody monitors a fleet of those cars, now it can show up to my house and charge me $1 or 20 or 89 cents, and that's the cost of my grocery store trip, right? Okay, that's reasonable. So if I'm only doing X number of trips per day, it's $1 a day, right? Or I'm going to work and back, and I go to the grocery store and back. It's like, so then my total cost for my car trips, there's how many days in a year? 355, 356, whatever.
Right.
So
right.
250. What's the day count in a year?
365.
365.
Yes.
Too much digital. Everything has got to be in 64 increments. 365 days. That's what $300 a year if you're doing a ride a day, right? When you get it down to that price, and Elon gets there, right? Then all of a sudden I don't need a car, because it's cheaper for me just to use my phone and get a car. And if you have a fleet of them are always driving around, it means the car is only 5 minutes away. I'm not waiting 30 minutes for the taxi driver to show up.
I mean, now that we have Uber and Lyft, I mean, like it's not too much of a mental leap to think
Yeah,
that
just say, hey,
we
they
can
go
have,
driverless.
maybe Tesla could be a verb. Hey,
Yeah.
I need to Tesla
I need,
to my creditors.
yep. I can see that happening.
Right. Yeah. So that's
Oh, oh.
interesting.
Well,
But
hey, it's been nice spending an hour with you. Happy Thursday, and hope you have. If you're listening in real time, because we stream different places, then hope you have a good rest of your day. And if you don't, then watch us and have a good weekend.
thank you, Eric. Fantastic chatting.
Yep.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye bye.